So I really wanted to make the title of this video books you haven't heard of, but for anyone who watches my channel regularly, I just talked about all of these books in a very recent book haul, so I can't say that. But I think I can still say that you haven't read them yet, because most of these books are really underhyped, they're a little bit lesser known, or they're new releases. So hopefully you have not read these books yet. Let me know how I did once we get through the list. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about the science fiction I've read recently, starting with Moths by Jane Harrington. This is a book that I received for review from Angry Robot Books, and this is a post-apocalyptic story that is set in a future where there has been a virus outbreak that specifically targets men and causes them to become ultra-violent. This is a book that I accepted for review, and then I admit that when the book actually showed up and I read the back of the cover again, I had a moment where I thought, oh my goodness, why did I accept this book for review? I have read many books at this point with a very similar premise to this, and I have hated all of them. I probably shouldn't admit this on camera because I know the publicist sometimes watches my videos, but yeah, I probably shouldn't have accepted this because I tend to hate these books. But maybe it's because I have a lot of trust in Angry Robot Books, because I said yes to this one, and you know what, it didn't disappoint. This is not what I expected to be. So my issue with these books typically is that it's all about this virus that turns people super violent, and then the story isn't actually a story, but instead just a action gore fest where the characters run around and act ultra violent, and it just reads like a really cheesy action movie, which is not the kind of movie I like to watch, let alone the type of book that I like to read. However, this really surprised me. For a book with a premise like this one, it was rather quiet. It's instead very smart and intellectual and thoughtful, and this whole story is told from a few different perspectives, but primarily an older woman who I believe is in her 70s. We need more elder protagonists. Please, people, write more and publish more of these books. And so I really love this older woman's perspective. She's seen the world, she's seen it change, she remembers what it was like before, and she's now living in a society that is more ruled by a matriarchal setup, and the men that have survived have been put in these controlled environments, and the world is just a very different place. You also get the perspective of a young queer woman, and you get to see kind of how the different stories interplay. And again, this was just thoughtful and quiet and everything I want these stories to be. I think it's a great response to some of the previous books that have been written in years past that really have a gender divide in a post-apocalyptic future or a dystopian future. And so I think that this one is much more intersectional, much more inclusive, and I really ended up liking it. Again, it's very character focused, it's very slow paced, it's not an action-packed book, and it was kind of just what I wanted. And so I was very pleasantly surprised that I love this one a lot. I was so afraid I was gonna hate it, and thankfully I'm coming back with a very positive review. I do recommend this one. It's a new release and it's definitely worth your time. Next up, we have Feed Them Silence by Lee Mandelo, and this is a very short sci-fi novella that I've received from Tor.com, and this is a book that follows a scientist who goes out into the wilderness to work on this experiment. She's found the way to interact or connect her mind to the mind of these wolves, and so she's going off to do so. She is leaving behind a wife or a spouse who is very reluctant or frustrated in their marriage, and so you have the strain on their relationship. And the problem is that this woman, the scientist, is just so obsessed with her work that she is really blinded to the larger things going on in her world. This book, again, it's very short, but I almost don't feel like it was too short. It's just a really smart, intellectual, unusual book, and the premise behind it is just really strange, but it actually works very well. It doesn't feel cheesy, it doesn't feel goofy. Instead, it feels very authentic. I think there's great character work. Again, a few number of pages, you have this main character. I think she's very understandable, her obsession with her work, the strain on her relationship, everything just makes sense. Because again, in such a short amount of time spent with this book, I really fell in love with it. I definitely want more. This book is very thought-provoking, it's very quiet once again, and I liked it a lot. I definitely think it's gonna stick with me for a while. Next up is Hospital by Han Song. This is another book that I received from the publicist, and this is a story that is translated. It follows a man in a dystopian future where right at the beginning of the story, he drinks some mineral water at a hotel, and it does not sit well with him, and he starts to have stomach pains. And through the story, he ends up getting admitted to the hospital. And you find out that this is not something that they want, because the hospital is not not a great place to be. And that is why the story is a dystopian, is that it really looks at the healthcare and hospital system and looks at it through a very dark lens. But the scary thing about this book, or at least the scariest thing for me, is the fact that so much of what makes this book scary draws from things that already exist. I think there's already a lot of problems with the way that a lot of our healthcare systems are set up, how they're monetized, and how we do or do not value life. And so this is just a really hard, dark book to read. I would not call it fun. It is not. If anything, you really have to be in the right space for something like this. And while I really like the ideas of it, I can understand why it has lower ratings on Goodreads, because it's not a fun book and it kind of starts to feel like a slog, because as the story progresses and the character spends more time in the hospital, things just go from bad to worse to worse to worse. And you kind of want to get off the roller coaster, but the author's not done yet. So I appreciate what this book is doing. Did I have fun reading it? No. Was I supposed to have fun reading it? Probably not. It made me think. It definitely brought up some interesting and scary concepts. I don't think it's gonna be for everyone, but I definitely think you should try it for yourself if it sounds up your alley. And again, if you're looking for a very dark, messed up dystopian, because this book goes there, and again, it's a story that draws from real life, which makes it so much worse. And next is Neom by Lavie. This is a book that I received from the publisher, and this is a short novel that is set in the same universe as the author's other book, Central Station, which I still need to read. But after reading this, I'm very interested to go on to their more popular, beloved work. This is set in the same universe, but you definitely can start here because it is its own story. It follows different characters, and while it mentions Central Station, again, this very much stands on its own. And so within the story, we follow a young woman who is traveling through the desert trying to get to a post to get off of Earth. She wants to get away from this planet. And within the story, we follow her as she is traveling through this desert area where there are all of these robots and other artificial intelligence who have basically lost their purpose. They have been freed and are no longer slaves to society and slaves to human. But because of that, they don't really know what to do with themselves. And I found that to be an incredibly fascinating concept to consider, and I actually found that to be honestly the most fascinating part of this whole book. I love artificial intelligence stories, and just the world that this author creates makes me want to spend more time in it, which again is why I'm so eager to check out their longer work. This book is just very compelling. It's very slow paced. In terms of plot, it's very slow moving. It's not really so much about the destination, but very much the journey. Literally this woman going through this desert space and seeing what is there, and just having the reader get to experience this imagined future. So if you can't tell, I really recommend it. This is the kind of intellectual science fiction that I really love. I know it's not for everyone. I wouldn't say this book is like perfect for someone who's never read science fiction. Not that it's not accessible, but it's the kind of book that you just want to simmer in. It's very slow burning, and I tend to recommend more sci-fi thrillers for those readers. But if you've fallen in love with the sci-fi genre as I have, I think that this is just a love letter to it, and I just adored it. So overall, just really love this one. Would love to see more people read it if it sounds up your alley. And in the meantime, I'm going to continue on and hopefully check out more of this author's backlist. Next, let's talk some backlist science fiction. And I received review copies of the 3 books in the WWW trilogy. The first one is Wake, the second one is Watch, and the last one is Wonder. And these, of course, are all by Robert J. Sawyer. These are books that I requested from the publicist because I want to check out their work. And within the story, we follow a young woman who has been blind from birth, and she gets the opportunity to do this experimental surgery that will allow her to potentially have her sight back. So yes, she agrees to this. However, there are side effects to this surgery that are not what she expected. This story is heavily involved in themes surrounding technology and the internet. And the hard part about a story that involves the internet is that the internet is very specific to certain points in time. So this book was written back in 2009, and I did not realize how much our conversations around the internet have changed between now and then, because there's a lot of mentions of LiveJournal and just different aspects to the internet. Even the way we describe the internet, we no longer call it the World Wide Web. And so it took me a really long time before I even realized why this trilogy is called the WWW trilogy, because that reference no longer even means anything to me. So So I do want to mention that in a way these books feel dated in the fact that they definitely pinpoint a certain point in time, but I don't actually mind that as a reviewer or as a reader because I actually think it's quite interesting. It brings back nostalgia for a time when we had to yell at our parents to get off the phone so we could go on the internet. Does anyone else remember that? So I really did enjoy spending time with this main character. She's a teenager, but she's a very precocious one. She's very smart. Basically the kind of character that John Green creates where this character is just way too smart to be a teenager, but at the same time it works within the story, and I actually really like that. This book, I should mention, this series is kind of a crossover between young adult and adult science fiction. And that's a bit of a criticism of this series because I think it would have worked better if it had solidly tried to stay in one camp or the other. I typically read adult science fiction, but I was very much interested in this one because of the subject matter. I love to read books that involves different forms of disability and bring different, again, representation to my eyes. And so within this story, the challenge is that we have a young protagonist, which doesn't necessarily make a book young adult, but the book read in a way that was very easy to read, very accessible, that just felt like it was written for a younger audience. Everything was spelled out very clearly so that a teenager could understand it. But there's also some sexual content in this book that just did not feel appropriate for a younger audience. I do not mind sexual content within a YA book, but it was written in a way that felt very inappropriate. And I'll be honest, I just wasn't entirely impressed by how it was handled on the page. I just don't know what messaging the author was trying to get across with certain parts that were included in there. So my feelings towards these books definitely shifted, and as I went on through the series, I probably had the most fun with the first book, and I would say that I think you can just read the first book and have a lot of fun with it, but I did want to go on. Obviously, I had all the review copies and read, watch, and wonder. I should mention that the author is Canadian, as you know I am, and so I was very excited that the author included so many Canadian references. The main character is an American living in Canada, so she is constantly pointing out all of the Canadianisms, talking about how we put gravy and vinegar on French fries and all of these things that I kind of forget are Canadian. And so I love those references, but by the time I finished the third book, there were so many conversations around like the Canadian banking system and our use of apostrophes and just things that I don't know if an American would actually be interested in. So I did worry a little bit that this book or this series perhaps became a little bit inaccessible to some of the American audience that maybe wouldn't care quite so much about the Canadian info dumps as I did. But at the same time, I binged through the series. I thought it was really engaging. I think it's a great place in terms of accessibility for someone who's newer to science fiction. This is an easy place to pick up. I just would be cautious giving it out to a young person. I probably wouldn't give it out to someone like younger than 16, just because I don't know how well some of the subject matter is handled. But it was an engaging story, which is usually what I'm looking for, so I do recommend it if you're looking for something like that. Now, switching over to fantasy, I want to talk about The Lies of Ajungo, which is a very short fantasy story that I was sent by Tor.com, and in the story we follow a young boy who goes off on a journey to find water because the city where he lives, the City of Lies, has a drought. There is no water there, so he goes off to find some. And I was really excited for the story because I love sort of an otherworldly story that I hope to have kind of different cultural influences within it, but I didn't realize quite how short this book was, and for me it read more like a fable than something perhaps more like epic fantasy that is more up my alley. So I just found that this book was a little bit sparse in terms of plot and characters, and just kind of felt, again, fable is a word I keep wanting to use over and over again for very good reason, that it felt like there was like a moral to the story rather than spending time with a fully fleshed out character, or rather than seeing someone go on this epic journey. So this book was not entirely what I wanted it to be, and my biggest thing is just the fact that it's so incredibly short that I don't know if it's going to leave a very lasting impact on me. It was interesting to read, it was well written, it was nice, but I don't know if it's really going to stand out as I start to make my end of the year favorite list throughout the year. I don't know if this one's going to come to mind just because there was so little in this story. Next up, we have Bitter Medicine. This is another book that I received for review from the publisher, and within the story we follow two characters. There is a French elf, and also there is the offspring of a god, and so they have magical abilities that allow them to be healers, but instead of being a healer, they go on their own journey through the story. This is a story that is very light in terms of tone and it's very cute and sweet, and I think it's very well done, but I did realize as I was reading it that this book is just not for me. I do love stories that are a little bit darker. I picked up this one because I love some of the elements, the queer romance, the fact that you have some different elements. I love anything culturally inspired by China and other Asian experiences. But while I appreciate a lot of elements here, this is just not personally up my alley, but it was really sweet. It reminded me kind of Legends and Lattes if you're looking for just a really cozy story. That's the kind that you're gonna get here. It's just sweet and snuggly and all the things that I don't normally describe as my favorites on my channel. But if that sounds up your alley, you might enjoy this one a lot more than I did. And finally for fantasy, we have The Unbalancing, which is a story that is very poetic in nature. We follow a character who literally is a poet, as well as another person who is a star keeper, and we follow them as they have a queer romance within the story. I picked up this one specifically because, yes, I do enjoy a queer element to the story, but more specifically because this one has a neurodivergent character. And while I appreciate those forms of representation, as a whole, the plot, the story, the characters just did not work for me. Particularly, I just never connected to them. And with a story like this, which is very character focused, obviously I need to have that connection. And so without that, I just found myself not deeply invested in the story. So if you perhaps love more poetic, musing romances more than I do, this one could appeal to you more. It's just not necessarily my thing, but I definitely know there's an audience. It's just, again, not me. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out? And let me know if I got the title of this video right. Have you read any of these books before? I know you probably heard of them if you watch my book haul, but hopefully you haven't read too many of them yourselves yet. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy, and if you want to give me a thumbs up, I appreciate that. If you want to drop a comment, even if it's just a spaceship, that works too. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.